Months ago, a man was ordered on a mission which was identical to yours. We have reason to believe that he is now operating with Colonel Kurtz.
The germ of Apocalypse Now may very well have started back in 1962, when a 17-year-old John Milius was first introduced to Joseph Conrad's novella, Heart of Darkness, by his high school English teacher in Colorado. About 5 years later at USC Film School, Milius would talk endlessly about how he wanted to make a movie about the Vietnam War with fellow student George Lucas. The young Milius, Lucas, and future Apocalypse Now editor Walter Murch would drive to Burbank to hang out with Coppola and others at Coppola's office on the Warner Brothers lot. Coppola said, "We sat around talking about our dreams. Obviously, many of them were trying to get their projects going. I recall George Lucas and John Milius mentioning a lot of guys who were returning from Vietnam, bringing word of the craziness of it, the drugs, the hallucination, the surfing, and they were cooking up a script that John would write for George to direct."
Germany.
With extreme prejudice. Are you an assassin? A soldier?
Lucas said, "At the time I was working on an idea to do a student film about a soldier doing hand-to-hand combat with a P-51 Mustang, and it was out of those conversations that we developed Apocalypse Now in terms of what it became. I'm not sure how you can do hand-to-hand combat with a plane, but okay." Lucas had directed an incredibly well-made short film during his undergrad called Electronic Labyrinth, THX 1138 4EB. It won the top prize at a student film festival, and Lucas was offered a scholarship to go to Warner Brothers every day for 6 months and watch them make a movie.
Yeah, they have a work scholarship where you get to work at a major studio for 6 months, for about a little bit of money, and you go there every day and watch them make movies. That's how I met Francis, was on one of those scholarships.
The film he chose to observe being made was Francis Ford Coppola's Finian's Rainbow.
Well, and one day I was working on the show, and I kept seeing a skinny kid with a beard and was always looking. I went up to him and I said, well, I said, "Who's that?"
I would like to see the students be able to work in the establishment and hope that someday they could work in the establishment and change the establishment rather than trying to branch off into something else.
Later, Lucas and Coppola from their indie studio American Zoetrope decided to expand Electronic Labyrinth into a full-length feature. This was THX 1138. In 1970, at the official launch party for American Zoetrope, they talked about how Apocalypse Now would be Lucas's second feature film after THX 1138. John Milius and Walter Murch were there, and the plan was that Milius would write it, Lucas would shoot it, and Murch would do the post-production. Filming was going to begin in 1971. The idea was to shoot Apocalypse Now like a documentary in black and white on 16mm, quote, "in the rice fields between Stockton and Sacramento, California." A friend and business partner named Gary Kurtz, no joke, took a trip to the Philippines to scout some locations there, but Milius suggested, jokingly perhaps, to shoot it on location in Vietnam while the war was still going. Of course, it would be near impossible to finance a film meant to be shot in a war zone.
But we wanted to actually go to Vietnam. And it was
You did,
really,
not
yeah.
George.
But there were other people, who, part of our group who would never, they would sooner go to Canada than be in the army, or they would sooner do something really rash like get married or something. But they were perfectly willing to go make a movie in Vietnam.
In a separate interview, Milius said, "We were going to make Apocalypse Now for $1.5 million in Vietnam. We got all these connections. We got people who were generals in the Air Force, and people who are going to help us get around. I remember all these guys around Francis at the time who were hippies and extreme political radicals. They all wanted to go make this movie. They wanted to go to Vietnam without any protection whatsoever and hop around through the minefields. It came pretty close, but then the studios started saying, why are we sending these hippies over there? They're a bunch of nuts. Some of them will be killed. There's a real war over there." So they stopped us. I mean, this was a time when there were riots in the streets about the war, and a studio executive is the last person who's going to want to get involved in the middle of that. Hollywood isn't exactly known for its social courage. Perhaps the main thing that got these UCLA and USC kids with no military experience to agree to go into a war zone for the sake of art was a movie called Medium Cool. Medium Cool was shot like a hybrid documentary and narrative, where the director had the actors go to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago with a, quote, partial screenplay. Stephen Travers writes, "The actors, playing journalists, moved around on camera along the periphery of the worst riot in American history, mouthing scripted words mixed with reality TV response to the violence about them." Lucas wanted the movie to be like the Battle of Algiers, with that handheld cinema verite style, made using simple equipment capturing quote-unquote realism by avoiding artistic effects. Milius and Lucas were into the cinema verite style at the time, but Milius said that he realized that it could only sustain for 30 minutes. Lucas decided that he would make the movie after a small personal project called American Graffiti. American Graffiti even had a character based on Milius named John Milner.
You've got just 2 seconds to get your ass over in your corner.
In the spring of 1974, Coppola met with co-producers Fred Roos and Gray Fredrickson to talk about going forward with Milius' screenplay. However, Milius said that once American Graffiti was a big hit and made Lucas rich, Lucas didn't really feel like going into the jungle to hang out with deadly insects anymore. Instead, he wanted to make an adaptation of Flash Gordon, and when he couldn't get the rights, he decided to make his own space battle movie called Space Battles. Wait, no, Star Wars. Lucas doesn't agree with this, saying, "I couldn't get the same terms Francis had gotten at Warner's, it was much less. But he was determined to hang on to the same number of points, his old number, so whatever Columbia took, I had to give up. My points were going to shrink way down, and I wasn't going to do the film for free. He had the right to do it, it's in his nature, but at the same time, I was annoyed about it. We couldn't get any cooperation from any of the studios or military, but once I had American Graffiti behind me, I tried again and pretty much got a deal at Columbia. We scouted locations in the Philippines and we were ready to go. By the way, points are a percentage of the movie's profit. However, Columbia wanted all the rights that Zoetrope was going to get. Lucas goes on to say, the deal collapsed, and when the deal collapsed, I started working on Star Wars. Walter Murch believes that Lucas made American Graffiti to prove to the studios that he could make a commercially successful movie and have the leverage he needed to get Apocalypse Now off the ground. But once American Graffiti was successful, he was still having trouble getting financing because of the subject matter. Murch said, Lucas asked himself the question, what is it about Apocalypse that I'm really interested in making? It was a story of how a small group of people, the Vietnamese, could possibly withstand the entire might of the US ranged against them, and in the end, come out victorious. What does that say about the human spirit? And since it wasn't possible for him to make Apocalypse, he transformed that story and set it in a galaxy long ago and far away. So Star Wars is George's version of Apocalypse Now, rewritten in an otherworldly context. The rebels in Star Wars are the Vietnamese, and the Empire is the United States. So Coppola asked Milius to direct Apocalypse Now, but he was busy working on The Wind and the Lion.
I said, I don't know, I'm in a real pickle here, because what we really need is we need a movie that is a big hit so we can make a lot of money, so then we can make all these little art films that we want to make.
Apparently, after reading the screenplay to Star Wars, Coppola gave Lucas an ultimatum, and Lucas chose Star Wars. Coppola was now in a bit of a predicament. Zoetrope owned the script, so he decided that he would just make it himself. Coppola said, I went to George Lucas, I told him we have to do Apocalypse Now. I said make it, and at that point he was into Star Wars. Lucas told Coppola, if you want to go make it, go make it. Coppola said okay, but his idea was to go the opposite way of George Lucas's handheld 16mm black and white war movie, and instead make it a huge IMAX spectacle war epic, something like The Guns of Navarone, and then make a ton of money and use that money to finance all these little art films they wanted to make. After all, he had only gotten the opportunity to make The Conversation because of the success of The Godfather.
Don't ask me about my business, Kate.
Despite Coppola and Lucas's conversation, Lucas was apparently disappointed that Coppola did take the reins of the project. Lucas said, all Francis did was take a project I was working on, put it in a package deal, and suddenly he owned it. Lucas had tried very hard to get the project off the ground, and as Stephen Travers writes, quote, Coppola asked him to direct, but he declined in favor of Star Wars. Yet Lucas felt a certain sense of entitlement, that his Vietnam movie was still his regardless of the contractual realities, and that it should still be there waiting for him to make it after he wrapped Star Wars. Milius said, I was always on Francis' side. George had nothing whatsoever to do with it, other than the fact that he was going to direct it. Just go do your Vietnam thing, John. Francis gave George ample opportunity to make the movie. George never did. He was too good for it. Francis has a lot of terrible qualities. He's a supreme egoist, and he'll take everything for himself. He is like what they said of Napoleon. He was as great as a man could be without virtue. But if Francis hadn't done it, that movie never would have been made.
I was always hoping, if I could make one big success, then I'd have all this money, and then I'd just spend that money making films like George always tells me he's gonna do. George Lucas is a very interesting experimental filmmaker, and he's gonna shock everybody because he's got the dough. He's just gonna go off and make a film someday, but he has a very exotic side of him, which I would love to see, and he promises me he's going to do it, and I believe him.
The interesting thing, though, is that these more recent small films of Coppola's, like Tetro, were actually financed by Coppola's wine business instead of the money he made in the film industry. By the way, you can now purchase your very own bottle of Apocalypse Now wine. It says that they, quote, created a wine that is as bold and exciting as the film itself. In the summer of 1974, Coppola decided that he would make the film, but he did not expect it to be so difficult. He had suggested that the film would be ready in time for America's bicentennial on July 4th, 1976. The movie would actually come out in 1979. So Coppola's idea was to make the film a big epic spectacle in order to finance smaller films. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Coppola wanted the production of Apocalypse Now to be similar to how the Americans did the Vietnam War, so that the making of the film would also be what the film is about. But what would be the cost of taking on such a project? Well, shortly after the film was finished, Coppola reflected on his journey at the Cannes Film Festival in a press conference he is now kind of embarrassed by.
We were in the jungle.
On était au jungle.
There were too many of us.
On était de trop dans l'équipe.
We had access to too much money.
On avait accès à trop d'argent.
Too much equipment.
Trop d'équipement.
And little by little we went insane.
The full quote, which we never really see, continues with Coppola saying, "After a while, I was a little frightened because I was getting deeper in debt and no longer recognized the kind of movie I was making. The film was making itself, or the jungle was making it for me." To help fund this series, I made a 25-page digital companion booklet for $1, where I tell you the story of George Lucas making the short film that would get his foot in the door of the film industry and change cinema history forever. It also includes my thoughts on the Scorsese controversy, where he said that Marvel movies are not cinema, now that Francis Ford Coppola has weighed in, as well as my responses to some selected comments on episode 1 that I found interesting. It's $1, and you can pay easy with PayPal, and your support helps me make more of these videos. Leave me a comment with your thoughts on this episode, and I might feature it in the next digital companion. If your comment is selected, I will message you with a code to download the companion for free. See you next time, and thanks for watching.